Thank you, Senator Ludwig. Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to oppose the Climate Change Authority Abolition Bill of 2013. We've said it, they've heard it, and former Prime Minister Rudd announced that we would abolish the carbon tax. Done and dusted. But this government is playing political games with the carbon tax. The carbon tax is all it talks about. You'd think that what is before the Australian Parliament is one bill to abolish the carbon tax. But what this government is trying to do is much more than abolish the carbon tax. And they're trying to hide that fact from Australian voters. In fact, the only time we hear the coalition government talk about all of the other parts of its abolition bills is in response to Labor putting the success of our climate change policy on the public record. The coalition government wants Labor to support much, much more than an abolition of the carbon tax. The coalition government would have us believe it has a mandate, that the federal election was all about the carbon tax, when the facts are the carbon tax did not rate as a top 5 issue. The coalition government thinks Labor should just fall into line with its wishes and its wants. Well, what Labor is doing, what the Labor opposition is doing, is acting responsibly. We are siding with the Australian public, with Australian voters, because they want action on climate change. Recently, the PM, Mr Abbott, invited Australians to let their elected representatives know loud and clear about their views on the carbon tax. And I thank Mr Abbott, because Australian voters are letting us know what they want, letting us know loud and clear that they don't support the abolition of the carbon tax without replacing it with an emissions trading scheme. This is exactly Labor's position. And despite Mr Abbott taking a gamble and inviting voters to email politicians with their views, I've not had not one email supporting the coalition government's position, not one email supporting its direct action plan. So I say to the coalition government, keep your heads buried in the sand, ignoring the views of Australian voters, ignoring the views of experts, abolishing authorities such as the Climate Change Authority, because they produce reports based on science and rigorous analysis, which lead to outcomes that don't support the government's rhetoric and don't support the government's instincts on climate change, and they don't support the views of the climate deniers who now make up this coalition government. This government doesn't want independent expert advice. It treats advice based on science or facts with hostility. It has nailed its colours to the mast of the rotten ship SS Direct Action and is not letting go. No matter what the science says, no matter what Australian voters think. And this move by the coalition government to abolish the Climate Change Authority demonstrates this government's complete hostility to independent expert advice. There is no reason to abolish the Climate Change Authority. In fact, there is every reason to keep it. And again, Senator Abetz and the government showed their complete lack of understanding of the Climate Change Authority when Senator Abetz said in the Senate on the 2nd of December in relation to the Climate Change Authority, and I quote, "In relation to the Climate Change Authority, why are we putting it forward? Because if you remove the carbon tax, there is no real need for this authority." End of quote. Again, the government demonstrates it has not done its homework. It doesn't know what it's talking about when it comes to climate change, because the Climate Change Authority undertakes reviews and makes recommendations on a range of matters, including emissions reductions targets and carbon budgets. The renewable energy target, how will we measure that without an independent authority? The carbon farming initiative, something I would have thought the National Party would want to know about and receive advice on. And the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting System. The Climate Change Authority Board, I don't know if the Coalition's had a look at who is on that board. They're leading experts. They are leading experts. Experts in industry, experts in economics, and experts in science. They're an extremely well-qualified board, a board that all Australians should be proud of. An experienced board. Why would any competent government ignore their advice and shut them down so their voice can no longer be heard? The Climate Change Authority has nothing to do with the carbon tax. The reason the government doesn't want it, doesn't want to keep it and wants to abolish it is quite simple. It doesn't want to be held accountable on its direct action plan. Because not only does it not have a single supporter for this policy, a policy which has been around for 3 years, not a single supporter in the scientific or economic fields. So when direct action doesn't work, the government won't be held accountable for their actions because they are stripping away any authority which might hold them to account. This government, despite its rhetoric, does not want to be held accountable. This government just wants to lick its finger, stick it in the air and see which way the wind is blowing. That's the extent of its interest in science. Instead, relying on its instincts rather than the overwhelming evidence of 97% of the world's climate scientists. Dr. Dennis Jensen, the federal member for Tangney, told interviewer Jonathan Swan that just because 97% of research papers published in scientific journals agree that humans are causing climate change, according to Dr. Jensen, this doesn't necessarily mean they're right. And I quote Dr. Jensen, who says, "The argument of consensus is a flawed argument," end quote. Dr. Jensen said. So Dr. Jensen doesn't accept the position of the world's science academies and Australia's CSIRO that climate change is caused mainly by humans burning fossil fuels and chopping down trees. Instincts, an absolute trait of the coalition government. Instincts, like former Prime Minister Howard, a view he had when he told a London audience that those of us who accept that climate change is real are a bunch of religious zealots, and that he'll trust his instincts. And you know, it's been a while since Mr Howard was the Prime Minister of this country, so one would hope that the coalition might have updated its knowledge, might have looked at some science, but no, that trust in instincts and gut feelings continues on in the current coalition. Just 2 years ago, Prime Minister Abbott, the person who wants us to scrap any policies which put a price on carbon. And Mr Abbott wants to scrap the job of experts such as those who work in and those who manage the Climate Change Authority. He told us, and I quote, "Whether carbon dioxide is quite the environmental villain that some people make out is not yet proven," end quote. So Mr Abbott obviously has not availed himself of 97% of the world's climate scientists. The Australian public know it, Labor know it, the Greens know it, but it seems the Coalition is living in some kind of vacuum, a climate sceptic vacuum. More recently, and quite frankly more embarrassingly, Prime Minister Tony Abbott accused the United Nations climate chief of, quote, "talking through her hat," end quote. Now this is a quote that's been repeated quite a lot in this House and elsewhere, but it's embarrassing. Our Prime Minister, the supposed leader of our country, says that to the United Nations climate chief, accuses her of talking through her hat. It just shows that ignorance about climate science is alive and well within the Coalition. And, of course, the classic was when Minister Greg Hunt, the Environment Minister, someone who is expected to know everything about his portfolio. And I accept that as a minister, I'm sure there's some views you take and some views you don't. But when you are so in the public eye, when you have such an important portfolio as the environment portfolio, you should be able to quote the science or the economics. Whether you agree with it or not, you should know what's out there. Yet, what did Minister Hunt confess to using? Wikipedia. Wikipedia. With all of the resources the minister has in his office, in the department, the Climate Change Authority, he turns to Wikipedia to contradict the United Nations climate chief. And he contradicted her opinion in a BBC interview. Again, oh dear me, how embarrassing. First, the Prime Minister of our country, and then our Environment Minister. How embarrassing for Australia. Well, I've got a message for Mr Abbott and Mr Hunt. It is proven. It is proven. And I've got another message. There exists an authority, the Climate Change Authority, a group of independent, expert and ethical experts in their fields. These people know that the science is proven. And why do they know it? Not because of their instincts, not because they stick their finger in the air and see which way the wind is blowing, and not because somebody told them. They know it through research. They know it through rigorous research, rigorous analyses, checking their facts, conferring with other science. That's how they know it. And they provided the former ALP government, the 43rd Parliament, with recommendations and guidance, with evidence, Mr Abbott and the Coalition government, not instincts, real evidence, and provided expert advice to allow the Australian government to set up effective climate change mitigation initiatives, not an unsupported direct action policy. The Coalition government is attempting to hoodwink the Australian public, and shut down credible authorities such as the Climate Change Authority. This government, more and more, is lining up with the climate deniers, ignoring transparent and independent information that goes against their political wants, that goes against the political outcomes that they want. Australia, such a leader of positive reforms in the past, a leader with our current climate change legislation. But now, under the Abbott government, we are continuing to embarrass ourselves internationally. Do we really want to line up with the likes of Moncton, who say, and I quote, "Science should only be practiced by people who adhere to a religion, preferably of the Christian variety," end quote. Or this one, and I quote Mr Moncton again, "The world's climate scientists and advocates for action are just trying to stamp out democracy." Is that what the Coalition's trying to do in lining up with the likes of Mr Moncton? Stamp out democracy? Or what about this quote from Mr Moncton? "Young climate change campaigners are like the Hitler Youth." Or Mr Moncton goes on and has a go at one of our credible scientists, and I quote, "Professor Roscano's views on climate change are fascist." And the last one, perhaps the best, and I quote, "Climate change scientists should be prosecuted and locked up." The sorts of instincts that the Coalition government are lining up behind are the sorts of views of the likes of Mr Moncton. So what this government must do is separate this bill from the wider carbon tax debate, just as Labor has done. And we got a lot of criticism from Senator Abetz as to why we would want to separate out these bills. Well, we want to separate them out because we want Australian voters to know that a credible organisation, a credible, factual, well-resourced, with an expert management board, the Climate Change Authority, this government wants to shut it down. Why? Because it mightn't always agree with what the government is saying. But we want to assess the Climate Change Authority on its merits. And we want to assess the merits of the Abolition Bill that's before us. Leave aside differences on the views of carbon pricing. Forget about the carbon tax, as nobody campaigned to keep it, and tell us and the Australian people why you want to ignore the Climate Change Authority, an authority which provides bipartisan and transparent information to government. This campaign of shutting down credible scientists and climate change organisations by this coalition government started with the firing of the former Secretary of the Department of Climate Change, Blair Comley, who dared to be more honest about the state of climate change than the coalition was willing to accept. They don't want frank advice. They tell us that they can get the advice elsewhere. But departments are not best placed to give free and fearless advice. Independent bodies are best placed to do that. But this government doesn't want any expert to advise on Australia's international targets. The Climate Change Authority said in their October draft report that Australia should aim for a 15% cut in emissions by 2020. CCA believe leaving our emissions targets at its current level will prove to be inadequate into the future. This is an example of the Climate Change Authority's frank and fearless advice. Repealing this Act and abolishing the Climate Change Authority is a demonstration of the government completely disregarding this information. The establishment of an independent Climate Change Authority to advise government on the operation of a carbon pricing scheme or a direct action scheme is critical. But again, this government wants to go backwards, turning back the clock, no assessment of whether the authority is good, bad or indifferent, no transparency. Let's just get on and continue to try and hoodwink people as this government continues to rely on instincts and not facts, not scientific evidence, I don't support the abolition of the Climate Change Authority. Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President.